Trump said the negotiations were in the final stages. He said either there would be a deal or the United States would do some things that are a little bit nasty. Iran's Revolutionary Guard threatened that if any further attack came, the fire would erupt into flames and transcend every border and domain. A tense phone call between Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed that a letter of intent was being drafted to formally end the war and open 30 days of structured negotiation, covering both the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's nuclear program. The Senate advanced a War Powers Resolution 50-47. The House was set to hold its own vote. 90 vessels have been redirected by the United States naval blockade. 2 Chinese supertankers carrying approximately 4 million barrels of oil exited the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said 26 ships transited the waterway in the preceding 24 hours under Iranian coordination. And Brent crude sat just below $110 a barrel, still well above any level seen before this conflict began. It is Thursday, May 21st, 2026. Day 83 of Operation Epic Fury. 83 days in, and the word that best describes where this stands is precarious. Trump says the talks are in their final stages. Iran says it is still ready for war on a scale that transcends the region. A letter of intent is reportedly being written. A war powers clock is running. And the Strait of Hormuz is moving slowly, under contested rules that no one has formally agreed to. This is Epic Fury, the U.S.-Iran War podcast. Follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to stay with this story as it develops. There is a great deal to get through today. Start with the Trump statement that set the tone for Wednesday, because it contained both of the contradictory impulses that have defined American posture throughout this conflict: diplomatic optimism and military threat delivered in the same breath. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Trump said, and the phrasing is worth noting closely, "We are in the final stages of Iran." He said a deal was possible. He then said that if no deal was reached, the United States would do some things that are a little bit nasty. He added, "If I can save war by waiting a couple of days, if I can save people from being killed by waiting a couple of days, I think it is a great thing." 3 distinct things were happening in that statement simultaneously. It signaled that a diplomatic resolution was genuinely within reach. The phrase final stages represents a more specific and more optimistic claim than anything coming from Washington in weeks. It renewed the threat of military action. And it framed Trump's continued patience not as indecision or weakness, but as a deliberate choice to preserve life, an implicit rejection of the criticism that he had been managing the conflict without a coherent endgame. Whether that framing resonates with the audience in Tehran is another question entirely. Iranian officials have repeatedly argued, across 83 days of this conflict, that American optimism about imminent deals has invariably been followed by threats, renewed strikes, and an expanding naval blockade. Their threshold for accepting American diplomatic signals as genuine has been worn down by the experience of the conflict itself. Vice President JD Vance, who led the American delegation at the only round of direct talks held so far in Islamabad last month, struck a deliberately careful note at a White House briefing on Wednesday. He said, in his words, "We are in a pretty good spot here." That phrasing, understated and noncommittal, was almost certainly calibrated to avoid raising expectations that could be dashed within hours. That pattern has repeated itself many times in this negotiation. The most consequential piece of new information to emerge on Wednesday was the reported contents of a phone call between Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, described by both Axios and the Wall Street Journal as tense. According to those accounts, Trump told Netanyahu that a letter of intent was being drafted, a document that would formally bring hostilities to an end and establish a 30-day window for direct negotiation covering both the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's nuclear program. The word tense is doing significant work in those accounts. Israel has consistently maintained throughout this conflict that the nuclear question cannot be deferred to a later phase, that any arrangement which simply reopens the strait and creates a new diplomatic timetable, without concrete and upfront nuclear commitments from Tehran, risks repeating the fundamental error of every previous agreement. The concern expressed privately by Israeli officials over the course of the past several weeks is that Iran uses negotiating windows to reconstitute degraded capabilities rather than surrender them. The period immediately after the April ceasefire, during which CENTCOM confirmed the IRGC had used the pause to tighten its grip on the strait, was cited as evidence for that concern. Trump, by contrast, appears willing to accept a phased approach, in the shooting first, then address the underlying structural questions through a bounded diplomatic process. That position reflects a reading of Iranian internal politics, shared by some American analysts, that the current Iranian leadership cannot make concessions on the nuclear question while under active military bombardment, and that a formal end to hostilities is a precondition for creating the political space in which a more durable agreement becomes achievable. That gap between Washington's apparent willingness to phase the nuclear question and Jerusalem's insistence that cannot be decoupled from any settlement has not been closed. The letter of intent, if it materializes, will need to satisfy both parties. That means it will need to contain enough on the nuclear question to give Israel confidence, while being structured in a way that Iran can accept without appearing to capitulate under duress. Finding language that accomplishes both simultaneously is an extraordinarily difficult diplomatic task. The history of Iran negotiations over the past 2 decades suggests it is not impossible, but it has never been attempted under conditions remotely like these. Move from Washington to Tehran, because Iran's signals on Wednesday were equally divided between escalatory threat and apparent operational accommodation, a duality that has characterized every day of the post-ceasefire phase. On the threatening side, IRGC leader Ahmad Vahidi published a statement on social media that was extraordinary in its scope and deliberate in its escalatory framing. He wrote that if any further aggression was committed against the soil of Iran, the fire whose promise was previously given, and which had remained confined within the framework of a limited regional war, would this time erupt into flames and transcend every border and domain. That formulation is a significant and deliberate escalation in language. Previous Iranian military threats during this conflict targeted specific countries, specific facilities, and the regional theater of operations. This language implied something categorically wider. The phrase transcend every border and domain carries connotations of attacks beyond the Middle East entirely, a signal to Washington that restarting the military campaign would not necessarily produce only the regional consequences already experienced across 83 days of war. Whether this is operational intent or to deterrent rhetoric, it cannot be dismissed without engagement. Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, who has served as Tehran's chief negotiator in the Pakistan-mediated peace process, also released an audio message on Wednesday. He said that obvious and hidden moves by the enemy show the Americans are preparing new attacks. The framing was consistent with a posture Iran has maintained throughout the ceasefire and negotiating period, publicly asserting American bad faith and aggressive intent, while simultaneously continuing to engage through the diplomatic channels Pakistan has maintained. On the apparent accommodation side, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy announced on Wednesday that 26 vessels, including oil tankers, container ships, and other commercial vessels, had transited the Strait of Hormuz in the preceding 24 hours. The IRGC Navy stated that this transit was ongoing, with permits obtained and coordination with its forces carried out. This is the crux of one of the most contested and fundamental disputes in the entire negotiation. When Iran says the strait is open, it means open under Iranian coordination. Ships wishing to transit must obtain Iranian permission and operate under IRGC protocols. When the United States says the strait must be open, it means open as a matter of international law, freely navigable by all vessels as of right, without Iranian approval or fees or conditions. Rubio made this distinction explicit in a Fox News interview earlier this week. He said, in his own words, what Iran means by opening the straits is, yes, the straits are opened as long as you coordinate with Iran and get the permission, or they will blow you up, and you pay them. He said that is not opening the straits. Those are international waterways. That definitional dispute has not been resolved. 26 ships transiting under Iranian coordination is, in the eyes of Washington, not the same as the Strait of Hormuz being freely and unconditionally open. The figure nonetheless represents the largest single-day transit count since the war began. A separate and notable development on Wednesday came from Chinese shipping. 2 Chinese supertankers carrying approximately 4 million barrels of oil exited the Strait of Hormuz, according to Reuters. A third Chinese vessel was reported to be making its way out. Last week, while Trump was in Beijing for his summit with President Xi, Iran announced it had reached a separate arrangement to ease transit rules specifically for Chinese-flagged ships. The arrangement underscores how the Strait's contested status has produced a patchwork of bilateral accommodations that fall far short of the universal freedom of navigation the United States and international maritime law demand. South Korea's foreign minister confirmed on Wednesday that a South Korean tanker was also crossing the strait under Iranian coordination protocols. Shipping monitor Lloyd's List reported that at least 54 ships had transited the waterway in the preceding week, approximately double the figure from the week before. For context, the pre-war daily transit figure was approximately 140 vessels. Current levels, even at their highest point since the conflict began, remain a fraction of normal commercial volume. The global supply disruption has moderated incrementally, but it has not ended. The United States naval blockade continued its operations on Wednesday. CENTCOM confirmed that 90 vessels had now been redirected since the blockade was imposed in mid-April, and that 4 vessels had been disabled. The United States Marine Corps AH-1Z Viper attack helicopter was patrolling near a commercial vessel transiting regional waters as part of the enforcement operation. The blockade, imposed following the collapse of the Islamabad talks, remains one of the most significant escalations of the post-ceasefire phase. Iran has described it as an act of war. Tehran seized 2 cargo ships in retaliation shortly after its imposition. The United States has framed it as a pressure mechanism designed to deny Iran the oil export revenues that sustain its military capacity and the IRGC's broader operations. The lifting of the blockade is among the conditions Iran has specified as a precondition for any comprehensive settlement, alongside sanctions relief and the withdrawal of American forces from forward position bases. Consider the domestic political dimension, because the war powers question reached a procedural threshold on Tuesday and Wednesday that carries genuine political significance, even if its immediate legal consequences are limited. The Senate voted 50-47 on Tuesday to advance a war powers resolution that would require the president to seek congressional authorization to continue military operations against Iran or begin withdrawing forces. The measure advanced after a Republican senator broke with the administration to support it. 3 senators were absent. It was a procedural advance rather than a final passage, but the 50-47 margin was read widely in Washington as a meaningful indicator that Republican unity on the Iran war is beginning to fracture. On Wednesday, the House was expected to hold a parallel vote on its own version of a war powers resolution directing Trump to withdraw United States forces deployed against Iran. The 2 chambers working on parallel tracks reflects the sustained and bipartisan nature of the discomfort with the conflict's legal basis. The core issue is the 60-day clock. Under the 1973 War Powers Act, a president generally has 60 days from the commencement of hostilities to obtain congressional authorization, formally end the military action, or seek a limited extension while beginning the withdrawal of forces. Operation Epic Fury commenced on February the 28th. The 60-day deadline passed on April the 28th. That clock has been running beyond its limit for more than 3 weeks, under an administration that argues it was stopped by the April ceasefire. The White House's position that the ceasefire terminated hostilities and stopped the clock is contested by legal scholars and by the legislators driving the war powers votes. Critics point to the ongoing naval blockade, the continued positioning of American strike aircraft and carrier groups, and the explicit presidential threat of renewed bombing as evidence that hostilities have not ended in any legally coherent sense. The gap between the administration's framing of the conflict as concluded and the operational reality of an active blockade and ready strike posture is the ground on which that legal contest is being fought. Even if both chambers pass their respective resolutions, a presidential veto would require a 2/3 majority in each chamber to override, a threshold that remains out of reach. The votes carry political weight as a signal of growing institutional unease, but they will not produce an immediate operational constraint on the president's military authority. Energy markets on Wednesday responded cautiously to the combined weight of Trump's optimistic language and the Chinese supertanker movements. Brent crude eased approximately 1.5% to sit just below $110 per barrel. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie estimated that if a comprehensive peace deal were reached and the strait fully reopened by June, Brent could ease to approximately $80 per barrel by the end of the year. The distance between current prices and that scenario represents the accumulated economic cost of the conflict's continuation. American pump prices reached $4.18 per gallon by Tuesday, a new war high. Trump, speaking at the United States Coast Guard Academy commencement on Wednesday, minimized the economic burden on American consumers. He told the graduating class he appreciated everybody putting up with it for a little while and said it would not be much longer. He also highlighted the Coast Guard's role in the war, in particular, the seizure of a sanctioned Iranian oil tanker off the coast of Malaysia, which he described as the third such vessel captured since the real fighting began. There is also a Lebanon dimension to Wednesday's picture that deserves attention. The ceasefire along the Israeli-Lebanese border, agreed in the weeks after the April pause, has been fragmenting. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon killed more than a dozen people in what was described as the deadliest day since the Lebanon ceasefire went into effect. Hezbollah has not formally abandoned a ceasefire, but the pattern of Israeli strikes and Hezbollah repositioning suggests the arrangement is under growing pressure. From Tehran's perspective, Lebanon is one of the fronts it retains as leverage. Any deal that formally ends the war with the United States but leaves Hezbollah degraded and Iran unable to reconstitute its Lebanon position would be a significant strategic loss. That calculus is part of what makes the negotiations so complex. Iran is not just negotiating about its own territory and nuclear program. It is negotiating about the shape of its regional influence network that was partially dismantled during 83 days of American and Israeli strikes. The oil storage picture also remains a significant pressure point on the Iranian side. Intelligence assessments in recent days suggested Iran's domestic oil storage capacity was approaching its limits, with estimates that Iran had between 12 and 22 days of viable storage remaining for ongoing production if exports continue to be blocked. That is a material constraint. A country that cannot store or export its oil faces an internal economic crisis with political consequences. The naval blockade, from the American perspective, is designed precisely to accelerate that pressure. The question is whether it reaches a breaking point that forces Iranian concessions, or whether Iran finds enough workaround routes, through Chinese buyers, through informal arrangements, through continued limited strait access, to sustain itself until negotiations reach a conclusion. Step back and weigh the totality of Wednesday's developments, because the dual pattern of simultaneous diplomacy and threat was again on full display, and understanding why both things can be true at once is essential for making sense of where this conflict currently stands. On the side pointing toward resolution, Trump described negotiations as being in their final stages. Vance said the United States was in a good spot. A letter of intent formally ending the war and establishing a 30-day negotiating framework was reportedly being drafted. 26 vessels transited the strait. Chinese supertankers moved oil. The Senate voted in a way that added political urgency for concluding the conflict before the war power situation becomes untenable. Iran's chief negotiator remained engaged through Pakistani channels. On the side pointing toward renewed conflict, the IRGC warned that a new American attack would trigger a war transcending every border and domain. Calabaf publicly accused the United States of preparing new strikes. The naval blockade continued, with 90 vessels now redirected. The definitional gap over what a freely open strait means remained unresolved. Trump simultaneously threatened nasty action. And the call between Trump and Netanyahu was described as tense, suggesting the United States and Israel are not operating from a unified position on the terms of any acceptable deal. These two sets of signals have coexisted, day after day, for weeks. They are not as contradictory as they might appear. The pressure and the diplomacy are running in deliberate parallel, because each party needs the other to believe it is capable and willing to escalate, or the other side loses incentive to accept the deal on offer. The question that has been present throughout this conflict is whether the mutual pressure eventually produces convergence, or tips into a miscalculation that neither side can walk back. The 30-day framework reportedly under discussion, formally end hostilities, then negotiate the strait and the nuclear program within a bounded window, would represent a structural compromise. Iran has long demanded that the war end before nuclear talks begin. The United States has long insisted the nuclear question cannot be cleanly separated from any deal. If a letter of intent exists as described, and if it is acceptable to both Tehran and Jerusalem, that framework could split the immediate cessation of conflict from the longer-term questions that neither side can resolve while fighting remains possible. Whether that document materializes, and whether both parties can endorse it, will begin to become clear on day 84. If this podcast is helping you make sense of what's happening, take 2 seconds to leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference to how many people find the show. And if you want the deeper breakdown of what's really going on and where this is heading, you can unlock the premium episodes directly in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That is day 83. The talks are described as being in their final stages. The threats describe a fire transcending every border. A letter is reportedly being drafted. Both of those things were said on the same day, by different parties, and both appear to be true at once. That tension is where this conflict stands. Back tomorrow with the latest.